Russian state television frequently broadcasts footage of frontline action that presents its military as technologically and numerically superior. It also shows triumphant soldiers returning home to their families, with carefully choreographed scenes of tearful reunions, medal ceremonies, and grateful communities welcoming back their heroes. Putin's propaganda machine works overtime to paint a picture of noble warriors supposedly defending the motherland, coming home to prosperity and respect. But turn off the cameras and the reality is catastrophically different. Behind the veneer of state-sponsored heroism lies a human-created catastrophe that reveals the true cost of Putin's war, both in human lives and money. Some Russian soldiers aren't just dying on Ukrainian battlefields, but they're also destroying Russian society when they come home. In the 3 years since the full-scale invasion started, veterans from the front have killed and maimed more than 750 people after returning home. Most often, their victims were relatives and friends, and most of the crimes were of a domestic nature. These numbers might look staggering, but they represent something far worse than statistics. They reveal a system that has weaponized its own people, created economic incentives that benefit only the military and political elite, and is systematically cannibalizing Russia's future for short-term military gains. Let's examine exactly what happens to Russian soldiers when the cameras stop rolling. According to the Kremlin itself, almost 140,000 Russian soldiers have returned to civilian life after fighting in the war against Ukraine by mid-2025. For reference, when the war actually started, Russia was estimated to have 300,000 troops being deployed in the first year. However, the reintegration support the Russian media frequently mentions when referring to returning soldiers is actually a bureaucratic euphemism for what amounts to a social disaster in the making. Many of these veterans are expected to suffer from PTSD and may also exhibit violent tendencies, according to the Center for European Policy Analysis and various news outlets, specifically Medusa, a Lithuanian-based Russian independent news channel. The channel's team spoke with specialists working on rehabilitation programs for Russian war veterans, using the investigation conducted by the independent journalist Farida Rustamova, who is also a former Medusa reporter, as a major source for their claims. The sources predict a range of major societal issues, including rampant drug and alcohol abuse. This comes from the fact that Russia is unlikely to provide prolonged medical and psychological support for soldiers who have suffered extreme or debilitating injuries, which are usually what allowed them to be discharged from the military in the first place. Considering that the Russian military has disproportionately targeted rural areas for its recruitment drives, these returning soldiers are already at a higher risk of being alcohol abusers. Faced with the prospects of returning to daily life with a vital body part missing and potentially seeing hundreds of their compatriots die on the front line, these soldiers would need extensive support for years, something that Russia might not be able to provide. And the scale of the mental health issues is staggering. Russia's defense ministry has estimated that 1 in 5 war veterans suffers from post-traumatic stress disorder. At the same time, Russia has fewer than 1 therapist for every 7,000 adults, and even fewer of them have experience treating combat trauma. Granted, the Russian government's response reveals that at least some of its priorities lie in trying to alleviate the negative effects of the war on its people. For example, Russia's Defenders of the Fatherland Foundation has received tens of billions of rubles to support veterans of the war against Ukraine and their families. Its regional offices help returning soldiers access housing, medical care, and other benefits. This is compounded by Russia providing hundreds of thousands of rubles to soldiers who are declared to be severely injured in the war, with the payout reaching up to 4 million rubles, roughly $35,000, in August 2025, which can be more than the soldier would make in half a year or even a year of a military contract. But these economic measures are by themselves revealing the scale of the demographic issues in Russia. While the soldiers and veterans receive ruble upon ruble of compensation and assistance, the rest of the population, including orphans, people with disabilities, and the seriously ill, often face years of waiting for benefits they're legally entitled to, or are more commonly simply left to fend for themselves. This preferential treatment creates a two-tier society where military service becomes the only pathway to basic social services, and one that is also open to corruption and abuse. This creates multiple problems, starting from the simple fact that Russia's economic measures only incentivize its population to enlist in the military and keep the war going. Then the military-industrial complex, energy and trade with countries like China and India all depend on Russia being cut off from the rest of the world economically and geopolitically. The cycle of dependence on war and close allies perpetuates, with Putin unwilling to propose a reasonable peace deal simply because it's in his best interest to continue the war, to maintain the illusion that people are getting the social services common in developed countries and which have now become out of reach for large swathes of the population. But not all soldiers get the help or assistance they need, or they fail to properly reintegrate into their environment after their return. This one has a fairly predictable outcome, turning to crime. The explosion of veteran-related crime isn't an unfortunate side effect of war, it's a direct consequence of how Russia conducts its military operations. Observers from the Jamestown Foundation, studying the effects of returning veterans from the war against Ukraine, are drawing parallels to those who returned from the Soviet Union's war in Afghanistan, who are known as Afghanцы. These soldiers played a large role in increasing crime in Russia near the end of the Soviet Union. But this time, the scale is exponentially larger. While the Soviet-Afghan war lasted for a decade, the actual deployment of Soviet troops was much lower, with an estimate of only 620,000 soldiers being deployed throughout the war. This is helped by the fact that the Soviet-Afghan war was much less deadlier overall, with only 15,000 to 25,000 fatalities suffered by the Union Army. In contrast, it's estimated that Russia has suffered 1 million total casualties by the end of the third year of the war in February 2025, and that the active deployment is around 700,000 troops and National Guard members. If we go through these numbers a bit more, it's safe to estimate that around 1.5 to 2 million Russian soldiers have been in Ukraine at one point over the last 3.5 years. And while it's uncertain how many of these soldiers are actually making it home, as opposed to dying or being counted as a casualty, recovering, then being placed back into service, the number involved is likely going to be much higher than that of the Soviet-Afghan war. If these veterans, referred to as Ukrainцы, join forces with nationalist politicians who want the Kremlin to pursue more expansionist policies, they could have a significant impact on local policies and security within both major population centers and small towns. The recruitment of convicted criminals has made the situation even worse. The independent media outlet Verstka found that at least 190 criminal cases were initiated against pardoned Wagner recruits in 2023. These ex-convicts, trained in modern warfare and released into society with legal impunity, represent a law enforcement nightmare. This has led to what some experts are calling the Wagnerization of Russia's underworld. Organized crime groups are recruiting former soldiers as contract killers or bodyguards, prompting rivals to do the same and escalating a criminal arms race. This ties back into the aforementioned lack of support for mental health inside the country. And when these veterans commit crimes and stand trial, they often receive lighter sentences with their service to the motherland taken into account. Moscow has also introduced a new law against discrediting the Russian armed forces. Initially, the law basically prevented independent journalism from being conducted to investigate the actions of the Russian military as a whole. But as crackdowns on freedom of speech continued, some people might be afraid of the potential consequences of reporting crimes committed by returning veterans. This further perpetuates the aforementioned cycle. Military service is one of the only ways to get the assistance you need, and yet that same military service can drastically increase the crime rate in urban areas, while also making those soldiers practically untouchable in the eyes of the law. Of course, the actual military service is far from sunshine and daisies for the average soldier. Faced with a lack of progress on pretty much every front, Russia has resorted to using obsolete human wave attacks to save up on precious military equipment and ammunition, the stockpiles for which have been heavily targeted by Ukraine. Using basic infantry as the only way to attack a country with layered defenses and perhaps the world's most advanced drone network is basically suicide for a large portion of the units involved. And there is regular news that suggests complete breakdown of Russian attacks